Welcome to the Chess Angle. My name is Neil. I am the founder and director of the Long Island Chess Club in New York. This podcast is all about chess, tournament play, and improvement at the amateur and club level. Be sure to follow us on Twitter. Our handle is at the Chess Angle. This podcast is sponsored by Chessable. I know many of you are already using Chessable, but for those who haven't yet, their courses are phenomenal. Chessable uses science-backed learning and the concept of spaced repetition to increase retention and ensure that you're learning the material. Check out chessable.com today. There is a link in the show notes. So a number of things going on, a lot to talk about before we get into some endgame stuff. First of all, here in the U.S., on the East Coast anyway, where I am in New York and on Long Island, we're right by the water. There's a major heat wave going on. It is hot. It is humid. You go outside, it's like kapow. But it is really, really hot. It's a good day for the air conditioning. Or if you're outside, you need to be in like a pool or something. But we are going through a major heat wave here. So those of you who live on the coast like I do, you know what I'm talking about. But it is hot. So, of course, the big news in the chess world is that Magnus Carlsen will not be defending his title, right? He announced it this past Wednesday. It's causing shockwaves in the chess world because now the championship is going to be between Nepo and Ding from China. And a lot of people are calling it, that it's not going to really be a world championship because Magnus is still around. Now, he's not retiring from chess. He's just kind of done with the world championship. I mean, he's 31. He won it 5 times. It's grueling. I mean, I'm just kind of going by what I hear. I'm not the most qualified person to speak about this, but I know it's very grueling. It's like easily a year of preparation, and it's, 2 weeks of classical games. And then, of course, there's tie breaks. Now, interestingly, I did see Magnus in person back in 2016 when he played Karjakin, because it was at the South Street Seaport in Manhattan. So where I am on Long Island, it's like, I don't know, maybe like a 45-minute drive. But that was very cool. I got to see them behind the glass. That was back in 2016. Now, if you remember, that was a little bit of a nail biter because if I remember, towards the end, Karjakin was actually in the lead, and then Magnus caught up, and then he won it in tie breaks with the rapid games. Now, for me, and again, I'm a Magnus person all the way, huge fan. I'm definitely Team Magnus. I would have liked to seen him play in this championship. But as far as the format, the only thing that sort of never sat with me was that they actually use quick games to decide it. Like the fact that it goes to tie breaks and it's decided by quick games, which is, it doesn't have the same integrity as classical games. I'm sure there's a reason. I guess it has something to do with, if they don't have tie breaks with speed games, that it's going to go on forever. I guess there's a whole thing I'm not seeing, but anyway, when he played Karjakin, that was wild. I mean, that was crazy. I remember that. And of course he won, but now again, it's going to be Nepo and Ding. So it should be interesting. I'm probably going to be following the chess news a little more than I usually do, only because this is a particularly interesting development, but we'll see where it goes. So I mentioned earlier the heat wave we're having in New York. So I've been doing a lot of reading, just enjoying the air conditioning, but I usually do a good amount of reading over the summer anyway. And I want to share something I've been reading, and it actually does tie into chess a little bit. So if I read a really good book, I do like to share it on the podcast. Now, I am a Kindle person all the way. I love e-ink. I love my Kindle. I mean, interestingly, it's actually a step backwards because e-ink is so, simple compared to like a typical colored computer screen. But I love it because there's no blue light. There's no eye strain, because I'm one of those people, if I stare at a computer too long, I get headaches and stuff. So the Kindle for me is like one of the greatest inventions like ever, as far as like modern technology. I absolutely love my Kindle. I know a lot of people do. Again, there's no blue light. There's no eye strain. And it's just fantastic. And you can, literally just think of a book and download it. It's like all there. Usually I'm a hard copy person. Like with chess stuff, I tend to favor, actual physical books. But for nonfiction or fiction, like just for narrative stuff, I really do like my Kindle. But I want to share a book I've been reading. I'm guessing some of you either heard of it or read it yourself. It's called 4,000 Weeks by Oliver Berkman. Now, as a side note, I'm a big fan of social science and pop psychology, all that stuff, like that narrative nonfiction. Like I love Malcolm Gladwell, Daniel Pink, Adam Grant, all those guys. In a lot of ways, I'm like a frustrated sociologist. If I were not a music teacher, I'd probably be a sociologist because I love that stuff, reading about, what makes people tick and human nature. And I will say 4,000 Weeks, it's kind of a time management book, but it's different. It's more about the overall outlook. And I'll tell you right now, it's much better than Atomic Habits. Now, I know people are going to be like, what? I know everybody raved about that book. Everybody told me to read it. I did. I wasn't that impressed with Atomic Habits. I thought it was a lot of platitudes. That's just me. I don't know. That's an example of a book that gets so much hype. I wasn't really blown away by it. Okay. This book, 4,000 Weeks, is much better. And it's not one of these like, ooey gooey, self-help books and, keep a journal and write down your feelings and like, I'm not into any of that stuff. This is actually a really, really good read. And his whole premise is that assuming you live to be 80, we're only on this planet for 4,000 weeks. And you really need to think about how you want to spend that time. So it's really about just prioritizing and making choices and understanding you're not going to be able to do everything. But as I said, it's written in just a very interesting way. It's like I said, it's not that like kind of corny, self-helpish, like, look in the mirror type of, that whole thing. And he actually says that a lot of these books that deal with time management hacks and like how to fit everything in, that actually makes it worse. And you actually don't get anything done. And he talks about prioritizing and choosing, and he criticizes the whole hustle culture that we're in. It's just very, very well written. I'm pretty much done with it. I'm about 3/4 of the way through. It's an easy read. It's like a 270 page type thing. You could probably read it in a couple of nights if you really want to. But I highly, highly recommend it. 4,000 Weeks by Oliver Berkman. Very, very interesting perspective. And that's really what he does. He kind of gives you a different way to look at how you're organizing your time and what you're choosing to do. And he, really reminds us that your time on this planet is very, very short. But I highly recommend it. Check it out, 4,000 Weeks by Oliver Berkman. And to sort of tie that into chess in a way, being an adult improver and being an amateur chess player and getting better, a lot of that is time management. That's a big part of it, making choices, not really related to chess necessarily, but, yes and no. But I just thought I'd mention it. It's a really good read. Check it out. It's available. So that's sort of my tip for the day, so to speak. And what I'll do, I'll put an affiliate link in the show notes so you can check that out. And now let's get into some Endgame stuff. So what I'm going to be focusing on here really is endgame decision making, not so much essential endgame chess theory, which is covered in the resources and, the zillion of videos and courses online. I assume you're learning the theory, like king and pawn versus king, all that stuff. And the truth is, most amateur endgames, because I see this at the club, end up being lopsided anyway. So in other words, when two amateurs reach an endgame, very, very often one side usually has an advantage, and it's just a matter of technique. So that's something to keep in mind. But again, we're going to be focusing really on decision making, because a lot of amateur players, they know the theory or they're studying the theory, but when they actually sit down for a tournament game, they're just making poor decisions just for other reasons. Maybe it's nerves or maybe it's lack of experience, whatever it is. But that's what I want to talk about, because you can have a lot of theoretical knowledge, but then when you actually sit down at the tournament, it doesn't quite happen. That's kind of a big thing we talk about on this podcast a lot. So let's get to it. So the first amateur endgame mistake, in my view, is that you're studying these unrealistic composed puzzles that you will never see in an actual tournament, or you're studying something like the knight and bishop mate, like king, knight, and bishop versus king, which number one is not what you need right now because you need the basics. And number two, you may go your entire chess career without ever, being able to utilize the bishop and knight mate. People say, oh, well, it's good to do because you're learning coordination of the pieces. And you don't need that right now, my opinion. And again, also these very weird composed puzzles where like there's 3 knights on the board or something. I mean, I'm exaggerating a little bit, but you get the idea. I would not spend time on those. You need to spend time on realistic endgame theory and endgame positions that you're actually going to see in tournaments. Now, the second mistake that many amateurs make, many beginners, beginning tournament players, is that they fail to activate their king in the endgame. It's so important. Of course, we want to protect our king in the opening and the middle game. We don't want it to be attacked or mated, and most of the pieces are still on the board. However, in the endgame, where most things are traded off, it's safe for the king to come out of hiding, so to speak. And it's very important to have an active king. Now, a lot of beginners, in my experience, they know that you're supposed to, quote unquote, activate your king, but they don't really know what that means. So if I were to ask a beginner, what do you need to do in the end game? He or she might say, well, you need to activate your king. And if I were to say, well, what does that mean? They may not be able to answer it. All right. So you have to understand exactly what that means. And what it means is that your king becomes, as I said, an active piece and plays an active role in winning the game. So what does that mean specifically? It will help you with passed pawns to queen a pawn. It will defend pawns. It will attack pawns. It will control squares. It will prevent your opponent's king from coming into your territory while also, you want your king to get into your opponent's territory. A lot of it is square control, as I said. A lot of it is, defending pieces or pawns. One thing that a king can do in the endgame, if there's an open file and your opponent has a rook on it, if your king is on the adjacent file, let's say on the second rank, he can prevent the rook from coming into your territory, right? So the king controls squares, attacks pawns, defends pawns, attacks pieces. All right, it plays an active role in the game. So if you have, let's say, a minor piece ending, and you only worry about your minor pieces and your king just sits there, but your opponent's king, is towards the center of the board or wherever the action is, that can lose the game for you, right? King position is crucial and can be the deciding factor in the end game. All right. So you need to activate your king. It becomes a fighting piece. It becomes a defending piece. All right. And of course, you don't have to worry, I should say, necessarily about getting mated because most of the pieces are traded off. Because you may think, well, aren't you supposed to protect your king? Yeah, but in the end game, it becomes a very, very active piece. And very often the person with the more active king will win the game. All right, depending on some of the other factors that are happening. So the third mistake is poor trading, or what I call blunder trading. Now, I refer to it as blunder trading. If you heard that term from someone else, give that person credit. But I've been calling it blunder trading for years. This is basically where you make a trade, as the name implies, that's a blunder, and you lose the game. Now, this can be especially a problem in the end game, because if you trade your final piece, let's say you have a bishop and your opponent has a knight, right? You might think, okay, point count, they're both 3 points, it's an equal trade. But what happens is you might make that trade so that it's just king and pawns, and then you lost the game. That's one of the most crucial decisions in a chess game, is choosing to trade down into a king and pawn endgame, because that's often decisive. It can be drawish, but you have to really analyze. But it's a big decision, but more often than not, very, very often actually, when that trade is made, one side is generally better. So you have to be careful that you don't make a trade like that and then you're in a lost king and pawn endgame. Because again, that's sort of the goal of all endgames if you think about it, right? You want to trade down into a winning king and pawn endgame, right, where you can queen a pawn. All right, so you need to be very careful because what happens is in the end game, we often get into time pressure. We're not sure what to do. And of course, what's the knee-jerk reaction? Oh, let's trade. Okay, so I have a rook and you have a rook, right? Point counts equal. Let me just trade rooks. But then when everything comes out in the wash, you realize that, okay, he can now queen a pawn and there's nothing you can do. You have to look at the whole board. So there are times where you're better off not trading, right? But you always want to trade where it's in your favor, or maybe if you think it'll be drawish. But that is so common at the amateur level where one player will offer a trade and it's a blunder because once those pieces are exchanged, then the other side is clearly better. So you have to be very, very careful. All right. That's why you need to know like all your king and pawn endings, and you need to analyze. Say, okay, if I offer this trade, do I have a king move or does my opponent have a king move that's going to win the game? Does he have a pawn lever that's going to win the game? Because those passed pawns, those are nasty. Those can win games. All right. And, very often material doesn't even matter if you have a passed pawn. But when you trade down in an endgame, any kind of trading, especially if you're trading off, your final pieces before you get to just king and pawns, that's a major, major decision. And you really need to analyze to make sure that you're not going to end up with a lost king and pawn ending. All right, so very, very important. Which brings us to number 4, which is huge, and that is the failure to spot endgame tactics. We often think of tactics as more of like a middle game thing or maybe like traps in the opening, but there are many, many tactics in the end game as well. And you have to be especially careful for a couple of reasons. First of all, our guard tends to be down sometimes in the end game because, it's the end of the night. You're tired. You've been playing for 2-3 hours or more, right? You don't want to think anymore, but that's when you really need to suck it up. Okay, so you need to look out for, first of all, these are just some ideas, passed pawn tactics, right? Of course, if you have a passed pawn, those are nasty. That can control the game. And you can often sacrifice a good amount of material to get a passed pawn. So you have to watch out for that. There are a lot of tactics involving a passed pawn. For example, let's say you have sort of a locked pawn situation, right? But your pawns are further up the board. You might be able to sack a piece to get rid of the, your opponent's pawn that's blocking yours, and then you can queen it, like things like that. So you have to watch out for those passed pawn tactics. The second thing, very nasty, are knight forks, right? Like let's say you move your knight and it checks your opponent's king and attacks his rook at the same time. You all know what I'm talking about, right? When you're in time pressure in those end games and your opponent has a knight and you're like, oh, you're looking out for those forks. Those knights are nasty. All right. Knights are very tricky. I know just in general, just as a side note, most of my games where I had a winning tactical shot, very often it involves a knight. They're just very nasty, tricky pieces. And those knight forks have saved many players who were down in exchange in the end game. All right. So you got to watch out for those. Okay. Those knight forks. The other thing is skewers, where let's say your rook checks your opponent's king and then he moves his king and then you win his rook, right? And you don't want to be the victim of that. Those types of things. A skewer is like a pin, but the more valuable piece is in front. Okay. And then, of course, back rank mate tactics, where your king might not have an escape square. Let's say he's behind his original like 3 pawns after he castled, and you simply move a rook or a queen there and it's mate. It may not be in one move, but there might be a tactical shot. Like if you take a piece, he can't take back, because if he does, you'll back rank mate him. These are all different tactics you have to worry about. I'm not giving you like an exhaustive, thorough lesson here on endgame tactics, but you need to watch out for those. All right. But those knight forks are especially nasty. Anything involving passed pawns or creating a passed pawn, because very often those passed pawns won't happen by themselves, but a lot of times there might be a tactical shot to create a passed pawn, and then that can win the game for you. All right. Because material may not matter. Your opponent might be up a piece or two, but let's say it's a knight and it's on the other side of the board and your pawn only has 1 or 2 squares to queen. he's not going to catch up to it. So those passed pawn tactics especially are nasty. So you need to look for those tactics, on your side of it and your opponent's side of it. But many players don't spot those, and that can be decisive. Now, I want to give an example from one of my games just the other night. So I was white. I played the Jabava London, which I'm just getting into. Thank you, Simon Williams, because this was a nice win. But anyway, I did win an exchange fairly early on. Now, my opponent was about 1680. Very fighting player. He's probably higher rated. I think he's probably more high 1700s. But anyway, very, very resourceful. He put up a good fight. And we end up in an endgame where it's king and pawns, and I'm still up the exchange. I have a rook, and he has a knight. So for the first time, he moved his knight where he was threatening to fork. And of course, I saw it, because anytime I'm up an exchange in an endgame and my opponent has a knight, I'm like ultra paranoid and ultra attentive to any knight forks, because that's just the worst, right? When you lose your rook like that. So he made a move where he was attempting to make that fork. So I moved my king, and, we're kind of shuffling back and forth. You have to just be very patient, right? In those situations, you don't want to force the win, right? It's almost like a game of chicken. So I was just sitting tight, just, putting my pieces on good squares, defending against his threats, not forcing anything. My line of thinking, I'm not saying this was the best way to do it, but it often works out this way. I was thinking, all right, I'm just going to keep it tight, and I'm just going to wait for him to crack. If he doesn't crack, and we'll see, I'll have to come up with a plan B, but let me just try this little cat and mouse thing. So then what happened was he then made a move where he took a pawn, and if I take it back with my rook, he will then fork me and win the exchange. But here's the thing. What he didn't see, I actually let him win the exchange. What he didn't see was that after he trades everything, it's what I was talking about before. After he trades everything, I have a completely winning king and pawn ending. I mean, it was pretty clear to see. Maybe it was a time pressure thing, but what happens was after we trade everything, on one side of the board, we have, each have a pawn facing each other. And on the other side, I have two isolated but passed pawns. So he can't defend everything. So what happened was I take this pawn, he goes check like ha, and then he wins the exchange. And I saw this through. And then he takes my rook with his knight. I take his knight with my king. So now it's king and pawns. And at that point, the game was over. And then he realized, okay, I can't, he still played on, but that's what I'm talking about with tactics. Like, it's no good to win the exchange if doing so means you end up in a losing king and pawn ending, right? You have to win the exchange with advantage. Now, if he had won my rook for his knight and traded down and he was better, that would have been different. Now, if I saw after the trade that he had a passed pawn, I wouldn't have done it. But that's why you have to evaluate the whole position. There are more important things than point count. All right, but that was a very, very common blunder where he traded into a losing king and pawn ending. Again, I can't emphasize that enough, not to sound like a broken record, but the decision to trade down so that there's only kings and pawns left, that's huge. And it's often decisive. Very often, one side is usually much better after that scenario. So you have to be very careful. Now, just to kind of extend that, because, what I try to do with this podcast is give you like realistic situations that you're actually going to face at the club. There was another situation in that same game. This was earlier on, obviously. And I have to give him credit because he was really putting up a fight. All right, because remember, even at this level, don't expect your opponent to roll over, okay? Just because you might be quote unquote better, they're not going to just give away the win. So what happened was he was looking for a queen trade. Now, he was down in exchange. So you might say, well, why is he going to trade, right? If you're down material, you don't want to trade. The reason is with this queen trade he offered, what it does is if I had taken the queen, all right, he would then have two connected center pawns, because right now I was attacking a backward pawn, right, which was a weakness. I want that to stay weak. All right. But if I had traded queens when he offered it, he would not only get these two connected center pawns, but the rest of the position was a little bit closed, which favors his knight over my rook. All right, and I saw this. Now, I had to take a breath here. It was a good move. I didn't say it, right? I didn't say it's going to happen. You're not going to, unfortunately, you're going to miss things, right? It was the end of the night. Now, it wasn't like a winning move on his part, but it was a very good resourceful move, move. I didn't say it. So when he made it, I thought for a while, and then I realized, okay, it's not good for me to take. So then I simply made another move where if he takes my queen, I'm still better, right? So you want the trade to happen on your terms, okay? And then he made another move, and it was like this little game of chicken. And then what happened was finally I maneuvered as such so that I made a move, and then he ended up trading queens, and it was still better for me because he still had that backward pawn, right? Because you don't want to allow him to liquidate a weakness, right? If that's your main advantage, you want to hang on to that advantage. You don't want to let him trade or do something where his pawn structure is now going to be better. But that's an example of not trading incorrectly. That what I did was an example of the correct way to handle a queen trade offer, I should say. That's a better way to say it. All right. So just because your opponent offers a trade, you don't have to do it. Right. That's another common amateur mistake, is simply trading because you can. Now, sometimes you have to. Sometimes you might miss something where your opponent offers a trade and it's like, oh, wait a minute, I have to take because otherwise tactically he's going to do this or he's going to do that. All right. But, I was very patient. He offered this queen trade. I didn't take it right away, a little manipulation there, but I was very cognizant of his pawn structure and his weaknesses. All right, because if I did take the queen when he first traded it, my win just being up the exchange, it wasn't so clear. And he had a good amount of counterplay, right? The closed position favored his knight over my rook. He had those connected double pawns in the center. His king position was good. Not so easy. I've mentioned this in other episodes. Being up the exchange is not a foregone conclusion. All right, because people think, oh, I'm up the exchange, I'm going to win. Usually, yes, and usually it's better, but if your rook is not attacking anything, if your rook doesn't have any open files, and if it really can't penetrate into your opponent's positions, it's not so easy. The exchange is tough. If there are no real weaknesses and everything's protected and the exchange can be tough in an endgame. All right. And very often it can lead to a draw. So those were just some practical examples from my game at the club the other night, as far as tactics and as far as trading, just to kind of give you some context. So number 5, the fifth common mistake for endgames at the amateur level is not studying your rook and pawn endings, and especially not judging defense versus counterplay. Now, a few things about rook and pawn endings, just some general comments. I'm not going to do like a whole deep dive and get into the weeds here, but rook and pawn endings, number 1, are very common. But number 2, they're also very tricky. All right. Now, Jeremy Silman mentions this comment. I am Jeremy Silman, which is, the old joke, all rook endings are drawn. You may have heard that, right? All rook endings are drawn. It's said in kind of a funny way, but there's a certain amount of truth to it, because rook and pawn endings, they're very difficult. They're often nightmares to win. Okay. Like I said, if you read I am Jeremy Silman's books, he talks about this a lot. But rook and pawn endings are notoriously tricky. But what happens is many amateur players, they will choose to have an inactive or a passive rook simply to defend a pawn. So I mentioned in the last episode, just to kind of make my comments clear, in the last episode, I was saying that sometimes just passive defense is best. Like your opponent's threatening something, just defend against the threat instead of trying to get fancy and look for counterplay. Now, sometimes ignoring the threat and making a more aggressive move is correct. It's all context dependent. But in rook and pawn endings specifically, it's a big decision whether or not you should defend the pawn or move your rook. And very often the correct decision would be to give up the pawn in order to activate your rook, because you'll end up winning, your opponent's pawn down the road. So in other words, your opponent is attacking a pawn with a rook in an endgame, and you move your rook to a very, very passive square to defend it. Meanwhile, his rook and pieces are much more active. That can lose the game for you. So it's a judgment call. All right. But generally speaking, you don't want your rook to be inactive simply to just defend a pawn while he builds his position. So it's kind of a judgment call. Again, in the resources we'll talk about, they go through all these rook and pawn endings and all these different ideas. But the point I'm making is you have to weigh, in rook and pawn endings especially, counterplay or really piece activity versus, inactive pieces that defend a pawn. So in other words, do I move my rook to his 7th rank where it's active and it's attacking his position, or do I simply, passively defend my pawn? Very often the former is the correct move. You have to judge it. All right. But you don't want your rooks to be inactive. And if you look at games from better players, you'll see very often they will choose to give up a pawn in order to have piece activity because they want an active rook and not a passive rook. That's a little bit of an advanced concept, but it's one that's very important, okay? Because again, you have to weigh piece activity versus material. That's the best way to sum it up, all right? Because if your pieces are not active, you can lose the game. Now, the last and 6th mistake that many amateurs make in the endgame, and this is actually true for players of all levels, is that you try too hard to win. All right. What I mean by that is that you start forcing things and you want the win so bad, but it's a very drawn position and you force things and then you end up blundering and losing the game. Now, one of the most frustrating things is, there's a lot of frustrating, I'm just laughing. There's a lot of frustrating things in chess, right? That's like a separate episode. But yeah, we'll do that. Most frustrating things in chess. No, but one of the most frustrating things, especially in an endgame, is where you were like crushing your opponent the whole time. Like you had him against the wall. And then for whatever reason, you lose the thread. This happens all the time, even at the highest levels. And then you end up with like this dead even endgame. It's just this very dry, stale position. And you're like, oh, how did this happen? Like I should have won earlier. I blew a win in the middle game. And then you get frustrated and you force things. You've got to discipline yourself. The other thing, and this is a big thing for me, is when you're playing a much lower rated opponent and the game is dead even. Now, it could be a number of reasons. It could be that the opponent is actually rated much higher. It could be you weren't having the best night. It could be your opponent was having a great night. It could be both. Maybe it was one little thing that you missed, but you're playing this lower rated opponent and you really want the win, or maybe it's like the last round of the tournament and it's important that you get the point, but nothing's happening. So what you need to do if you really want the win, you'd need to be extremely patient. You need to wait them out. And if you start to force things and try to push it and try to create some tactic and maybe I'm going to sack a piece, that's one of the best ways to lose the game. Now, here's where we get into like draw offers and stuff like that. We're going to talk a little bit more about that next week. So I don't want to get into that now because this is a topic we could talk about for hours. But the whole point of this segment of this episode is that you don't want to try too hard to win. You don't want to force things where, a winning solution doesn't exist. Now you can hang in there. You can maybe try something. You can hope for a mistake on your opponent. But if you push too hard, this is the point. If you push too hard, that's one of the best ways to lose the game. So if you absolutely don't want to draw, you just need to be extremely patient and play solidly and hope for a mistake by your opponent. Now, if he's much lower rated, there's a good chance that's going to happen. If it's a higher rated opponent, that may be tough. But if you try to just force things like, oh, I just really want to win, and you just push, that's one of the best ways to lose the game. So that's something to think about we've spoken about that a little bit in previous episodes, but the whole thing with that and like draw offers, I'm going to stop here with that because we're going to be getting a little bit into that next week. That's part of the conversation. So just a little bit of a sneak preview there. So now let's talk about the resources I have listed for Endgame improvement. Now, I went a little old school with the resources because for the Endgame, most of my knowledge and studying came from books. Because remember, I will not list a course, I will not list anything as a recommended resource unless I have experience with it myself personally. All right. Now, I will say Chessable does have some amazing endgame stuff. Just glancing at it, I just know, I can just tell from looking at it and from the authors that I'm sure it's good. But I'm not going to list it here because, as I said, for me, most of my endgame stuff did come from books. All right. I'm not going to put a course unless, I've done some of it myself. But I can just tell you by reputation, Chessable has some great stuff, but just check it out for yourself. But what I listed here, because I have experience with these, are two well-known books. I'm sure I'm not the only person to recommend these. These are sort of like legendary chess books. And in addition, I'm sure there are other endgame books that other people may say are better. And why didn't you include this? But I'm just including the two that I've been using for years. They're both fantastic. The first one is, from my hero, Jeremy Silman. It's Silman's complete endgame course from beginning to master. It's a pretty thick book, right? You could probably use it as a weapon or a doorstop if you're, done reading it for chess. But it's not necessarily something you're going to read from cover to cover, but it's a full reference book. And he actually organizes it by rating. Like if you're rated 1,000, these are the end games you should start learning. If you're rated 1,400, these are the end games you should start learning. And as with all of Silman's books, there's a lot of excellent explanatory prose. He makes it very easy to understand. He writes in very clear, plain English. It's extremely coherent. It's extremely easy to follow, regardless of your rating, whether you're a beginner, whether you're an intermediate, or even for advanced players, you can use Silman's Endgame book. All right. So if you're rated 1900, you can get something out of it. If you're a beginner, you can get something out of it. If you're, a beginning tournament player, you can get something out of it. Everything's in there, right? It says it in the title, complete. But I've been using this book for quite some time. It's outstanding. Everything's in there. It's like the old pasta sauce commercial. What was that? Ragu? What's in the ragu pasta sauce? Don't worry. It's in there, right? It's in there. It's like Silman's Endgame course. All right. This book, Silman's, complete endgame course from beginning to master. It's readily available. I have a link. It's outstanding. So that's pretty thorough. Now, the other book, which I really like, is Pandolfini's Endgame course. Pandolfini, of course, the well-known chess coach. He was portrayed in Searching for Bobby Fischer. He famously coached I Am Josh Waitzkin. Pandolfini, one of the premier chess educators. What I like about his endgame course, it's almost like a puzzle book. He devotes one endgame to each page. There's like a diagram, and he lists the solution. And again, it also has excellent explanatory text. So Pandolfini's endgame course is also a great teaching tool. When I was, working with beginners, I would use that as well. It's a little more, I don't want to say it's more quick and dirty, but Pandolfini's endgame course is kind of like, all right, here's the position, here's the solution. But he covers all these possible scenarios, like king and pawn versus king, on the 6th rank, on the 7th rank, okay, very, very thorough. Same thing with the Silman books, but with both of these resources, I mean, this is probably all you need as far as books. Now, are there other books out there, 100 endgames you must know? Of course. I mean, we can debate this all day. There are other books. Again, this. Whenever I list resources, I'm listing stuff, that I use myself, that I've used myself, that I have experience with, and that I'm confident recommending. If you're using another endgame book that you feel is thorough, go for it. Don't take this as, well, it has to be these two. I'm just saying these two books are outstanding and, will keep you in good stead for, quite some time. I mean, at the amateur level and even beyond, this may be all you need, at least for a long time, right? It has all the essential theory. Like I said, what I like about the Silman book is that he organizes it by rating. The Pandolfini book is kind of like one Endgame per page. It's more of like almost like a workbook, the way he does it. Both are readily available. Both are excellent. But if you want to go as far as courses like online stuff, there's plenty of stuff out there. I just have not used those enough that I would recommend them, because again, not to sound like a broken record, I will not recommend anything unless I have experience with it myself, actually using it. Okay. So that's important. I want to stick to that policy, with unwavering consistency. All right. So just to wrap this up, we looked at 6 common endgame concepts, or really mistakes on the part of amateurs. All right, so I would avoid studying those, unrealistic, composed, endgame, self-help mate, puzzle type things. Stick with positions that you're actually going to see at the club in an actual tournament. Second thing, make sure you're activating your king. Very, very important. Third thing, huge, be careful of poor trading or blunder trading. All right, you want to make sure if you're trading that it's in your favor somehow. Number 4 was endgame tactics, failure to spot those tactics on both sides, tactics involving passed pawns, knight forks, things like that, back rank mate. All right. Number 5, we talked about rook and pawn endings, and you have to weigh piece activity against material, right? You don't want to end up with a passive rook just to save a pawn. You have to weigh that. Sometimes it might be correct, but those rook and pawn endings, very, very tricky, but also very, very common. So you need to know that theory. And then number 6 is basically not forcing things, trying too hard to win. And that's a tough one. All right. But you need to know when a drawn position is drawn, or if it's going to be very, very tough to win. All right. And the trick is you have to wait your opponent out. Don't try to force things. Don't play some sketchy tactic where you're not seeing it through, where it's like, all right, let me try this. Generally, whenever you say, let me try this, that's usually bad. You got to be very careful when you say, let me try this. It shouldn't be, let me try this. It should be, I spent a little time analyzing this position, and if I make this move, I can, I kind of know what's going to happen. Just be very careful, because if you make these sort of desperate tactical shots because you want the win so badly, that's a great way to lose the game. All right, so that's something to think about. And again, we're going to get into more of that next week as far as draw offers and things like that. So the way it stands now, this is our penultimate episode for season 2. Barring any unforeseen circumstances, I do have a very special guest booked for next week. Okay, we're due to record this week, so that'll be an awesome way to end it. Really appreciate you listening. As always, I hope you win your next game. Have a great day, everybody.